I've spoken to so many doctors, because they don't have enough time during the day, it accumulates.
Yeah.
And then they stay up till all hours of the night.
Yeah. Taking
Their notes
Yeah.
or putting their notes in. So we've been able to use generative AI where you can free form, almost stream of consciousness style dictate.
Yeah.
So I saw, patient John Smith, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah. And I don't have to try to structure my thoughts so much. And then literally in less than 60 seconds, the generative AI can structure that into a really...
Welcome to Independent Thinkers on Digital, a series of podcasts where I get to have incisive dialogues with some of the world's leading thinkers on matters of digital policy about the sort of issues that really concern our world today. I'm William Webb, the CTO of Access Partnership, the world's leading technology policy advisory company. And today I'm delighted to have with me Colin Christie. Colin is an entrepreneur, a global connector and educator, and a frequent speaker on digital topics. His interests are widespread, but include recent advances in generative AI and how it's reshaping the world of work, education, and life in general. He has many hats. Amongst those, he's the co-founder of the Analytics and Artificial Intelligence Association of the Philippines. He served as the president of its board of trustees and is currently chairman of its advisory committee. He's an independent director of Now Corporation, a company that does many things in the Philippines, including communications. And he's on many health-related boards and is an innovator of AI in behavioral health, amongst many other roles. He began his career in the semiconductor industry in California's Silicon Valley and holds a Bachelor of Science degree in chemical engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. Colin, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Excellent. Thank you, William. It's a pleasure to be here.
So with your background in recent years in the Philippines, I'm keen to pick that as an example and to look at that in more detail and to look at its use of digital, in particular comms and AI and things like that, and to try and understand better what it does well, because you and I were both at a conference yesterday, the Access Partnership Technology Policy Exchange Conference, and we were chatting there about the extent to which the Philippines perhaps is better than many of the other countries in the region in terms of how well it's managed to deploy communications. Tell me a bit more about that. Why do you think that, and why do you think that's come about compared to some of the other countries, given that on the face of it, it's a really challenging place to put comms in with 7,000 islands, you were telling me?
Yes, exactly. I think probably comes across a bit surprising that that's the case. But I think it's actually sort of deeply embedded culturally, because it turns out back in the SMS days when that first emerged, Philippines was actually number one in the world. It was the first and fastest adopter of SMS. And in fact, I remember back when I was making trips from the U.S. to the Philippines, I would go back to the U.S. and I would talk about text messaging or SMS, and my American friends would say, "What's that?" They hadn't even heard of it. And all the Filipinos were madly texting.
And is that
away.
Cultural? Is that because it fitted their lifestyle, or was there something else that promoted it more in the Philippines?
Yeah, I think cultural fit the lifestyle. And also you have to remember there's a large number of Filipinos abroad. They call them OFWs, overseas Filipino workers. And so that was an inexpensive way, without making a voice call, to stay in contact with relatives in the Middle East, in Europe. So I think it was that. And then in the more recent generation, post launch of iPhone 2007 and onwards, Philippines just latched on to social media. And in fact, even to today, if you look at the charts of number of hours per day, I don't know if this is a good or bad thing, but the number of hours per day on, for example, Facebook or social media these days, TikTok and Instagram, Philippines is number one, and not just slightly. Head and shoulders number one in terms of usage of social media.
I was looking at that earlier, and it's like 10 hours a day or something.
It's crazy.
Which for someone like me who hardly even knows what social media is quite astounding. So what's happening in the world of telecoms? They've got 5G now, haven't they? But is that important? Is that recent?
Yeah, it's recent and spotty.
Yeah.
And the problem is handsets are too expensive. So it's just, sort of one small segment of the population but I think to follow on the previous point, it's a demand-driven situation there. So I think that gave confidence to the telcos to put in the investment because low risk, you already had the world's number one usage of social media and they knew messaging apps would soon take over SMS. And in fact, I think that's probably another economic factor. The telcos were making a lot of money on the SMS and realized that was about to become obsoleted.
Yeah.
So in fact, what happened was the telcos made partnerships with social media, for example, Facebook, and one of the telcos launched a free service so that if you were using your mobile phone to connect to Facebook, you didn't have to pay data charges.
Interesting.
So so very much demand driven.
And I was reading that the market, essentially the mobile market, collapsed to a couple of operators a while back, and as then in the last few years there's been a new operator introduced. But during the time that it was a duopoly, prices were relatively high, understandably.
Correct.
Because that was. But perhaps was that something that effectively allowed more investment? Because although those companies were perhaps making more money than they might have done otherwise, at least they had the revenue stream to build out further. Whereas I'm guessing in other countries in the region, the operators may have not had those kind of resources to build on.
Yes, I think that's exactly correct. But I think we also have to distinguish between Metro Manila and maybe Metro Cebu, the second largest city, and then the rest of the Philippines, as you mentioned, 7,000 islands, population nominally 115 million, but 15 million plus just in Metro Manila.
Yeah.
And also in a compact, it's not super widespread geographically, so that gives tremendous economy of scale. So not only are you getting pretty good rates, as you pointed out, but you can build your infrastructure in a fairly small number of square kilometers and have a market of right off the bat of 15 million people. So the very good model.
And what's the overall coverage look like? Does it extend well into rural areas and across all these islands? And if so, was that because a regulator or someone similar forced that, or was that the choice of the operators?
Yeah, so that's the area that's the picture that's not so bright, is once you get out of the major metro areas, you drop down to really, low bandwidth connections, maybe not even LTE, maybe even back, to 3G, for example. As you mentioned, there's been a duopoly for the last few years, but a couple of years ago, the third telco was, awarded licensing rights and frequencies. And very much to your point, one of the key factors in being given that grant is that they had to commit to fairly high coverage goals on a very specific timetable as well to give broad coverage across the country. And then I think the thought being that only applies now to this third entrant, but now that puts competitive pressure on the other two to follow suit.
Yeah, that's often the case, actually, that you only need to have a coverage obligation on a subset of the operators. And by and large, the others feel that they have to then follow, because otherwise they'll lose subscribers to that. And you're involved with an operator now. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I serve as an independent director for Now Corporation. So it's a conglomerate, but it's largely in telecom, broadband, and was very excited this past year to sign an agreement with the U.S. government through the U.S. TDA. As you probably know, the U.S. has this Clean Network Initiative where they're encouraging people to join who sort of commit to use, let's just speak blunt, non-Chinese equipment. And along with that came a grant to Now Telecom, which is a subsidiary of Now Corporation, and an award to Bell Labs. So Bell Labs is doing a study and a design for a 5G network in partnership with Now Corporation in the Philippines. So it'll start out with a pilot rollout in Metro Manila to test effectiveness. But I think to what I said earlier, so that's very exciting. And in fact, it was quite an unusual thing, because Kamala Harris had a visit to the Philippines last year, and she actually announced that partnership as part of that visit. So that was, a good thing for Now Corporation. But I think the challenge is, again, the handsets, right? So, yes, we can roll this out. We can have a fantastically designed, Bell Labs, Nokia design network, but can people afford the handsets, let alone the monthly cost? So Mel Velarde, who's our chairman and founder of Now Corporation, who has a deep background, by the way, back into the cable TV days in the Philippines, is optimistic that within a short number of years, there'll be low-cost phones. I think they're discussing, for example, manufacturers out of India who have a similar challenge, right?
Yeah.
So whatever handsets they develop, for a much larger population in India than the Philippines will benefit from that.
Do you think developing countries kind of almost overreach a bit when they want something like 5G? I mean, it's the poster child of comms, and you can imagine politicians being very keen to say, "Look at us, we've got a system that's as good as the US or the UK." But you talked about the problems there, and of course 5G is harder to get really good coverage from as well, and things like that. Would there be some benefit in perhaps not pushing quite so hard on that, or do you think it's worth doing anyway from an aspirational point of view?
Yeah, well, I do think it's worth aspirationally, and I do agree with what you're saying, that largely it's a little bit for show.
Yeah.
However, and this is another area, if I sort of put in a plug for Now Corp again, is industrial use is needed and now because of fourth industrial, 4IR projects, fourth industrial revolution, IoT connectivity, and that sort of thing. So one of the things that Now is already doing, even ahead of this USTDA project, is fixed wireless access using 5G into industrial zones. And the Philippines is actually ideal for this because years ago, for tax incentive reasons, they created industrial parks, and then companies who would launch their facilities in those parks would get favorable tax treatment. So you have very naturally, areas. You don't have the industrial parks and the residential parks sort of mixed, together. They're very much separate. Mostly, much of the south of the downtown metro and much of the north of the downtown metro. And so again, it's good economics because you can put in 5G, fixed wire, FWA, and then you can serve commercial industrial customers. And I think that also helps just with gaining core competency and delivering those kinds of technologies.
Interesting. It's probably too broad a picture to really say, but what sort of things happen in those parks? Is it more manufacturing, or is it software, or is it just such a broad swathe of things that you can't
it's mostly manufacturing. So, Philippines tends to be known for its BPO, or business process outsourcing sector. About 1.5 million people work in that sector, and it's has a huge economic benefit to the country. But it turns out that the semiconductor and electronics sector is probably 40-50% larger than the BPO sector. It's just not talked about much. So there's still quite a lot of semiconductor and electronics, back-end manufacturing, packaging, assembly, that sort of thing. There's actually a fairly healthy local automotive industry there. Toyota, for example, but also now what's in high demand is electric motorcycles.
Interesting.
And one of the large conglomerates just announced opening up a factory for manufacturing of electric, e-bikes. Fast-moving consumer FMCG type of products, and of course food manufacturing. So these are the types of areas that would benefit from a 5G and industrial type of network.
So it's an interesting picture. I found that fascinating because I'd never sort of fully understood, but effectively an initial kind of almost natural advantage of the Philippines in the way that they use SMS initially and then social media, driving demand, driving a willingness to invest. You talked a bit about kind of government involvement in terms of sort of US government involvement. Has there been good government involvement from the Philippines? Has it been indifferent? Have they done good things? It sounds like at least introducing a third competitor was probably a good thing, but whether actually allowing the merger that resulted in needing a third competitor was such a good thing unclear.
Yeah, no, it was very good, and partly I think in response to public outcry, because again, just speak a little bit bluntly, the performance of the duopoly networks was poor. So, we were talking about typical internet speeds, 3, 4, 5 megabit type speeds, which is not acceptable, especially with YouTube and TikTok and things like that, requiring vast amounts of bandwidth. So the public, very much wanted better bandwidth. The government actually was only fairly recently, I think it was 2015, that what we call DICT, the Department of Information Communications Technology, was even formed. Before that, there was an ICT office, but it was part of another agency. It wasn't, a full cabinet level position. So, and I must say that the current secretary of DICT and the former ones have been excellent. They've been very progressive, very knowledgeable about, what needs to happen. And there has been a very healthy partnership between, for example, DICT and industry. And I think to connect the dots, it connects also back to BPO, because can you imagine how much telecom infrastructure is needed to support, basically the world's largest call center in the Philippines, right? So that's another factor. So it's not just even the consumer demand, but there's a huge BPO demand for highly reliable. And that, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, you have to differentiate between Metro Manila and the other cities. So that's actually another good news story, because about a decade ago, the government was wrestling with just heavy congestion in Metro Manila. Our traffic, by the way, if you ever come and visit, it'll blow your mind.
Okay, I'll bear that in mind.
You cannot move on the roads at, rush hour, let alone sort of the rest of the day. So they were thinking, how do we decongest Manila? Well, the BPO company said, hey, look, we're more than happy to go to 12, 15 different cities, help us, but we need reliable power, and we need the telco infrastructure. And so about a decade or so ago, they had a project called Next Wave Cities, where they identified about a dozen, as I said, cities, work with the local government units in those cities, the local universities for talent, and then with the telcos and with the power companies, to put all of those elements together. And those have been very successful. So these are cities that, most people outside the Philippines would never have heard of, like Iloilo, Dumaguete, places like this. But this has been excellent in that, again, the BPO sector bringing in that reliable power, that reliable telecom, well, now that infrastructure can be now extended for consumer purposes as well.
And how did the government get that infrastructure? Did they pay for it, or did they just kind of tell the energy companies and the telcos that they had to do it, or effectively were the telcos happy to do it once they realised that there was going to be that demand for it? Yeah,
more the latter, I think.
Okay.
Again, investment is all about understanding risk and return. So if you have, for example, okay, we're going to this next wave city, the specific location. We've already got a handful of large international BPO firms who have committed to put a facility in and sign, a multi-year agreement for telecom services. Then you feel quite comfortable putting in the investment. There's very little risk.
That makes good sense. And I think a lesson a lot of other places could look at, which is, rather than just requiring people to do things without it being clear how they get paid back, kind of creating a win-win situation where they're encouraged to invest because they know that there's going to be enough payback as a result of it.
Yes, that's right.
Let's pivot a bit to talk about AI. That's something that you've been spending a lot of your time looking at recently. And, of course, AI has been around for a long time, but then in the last year or so, we've suddenly had the poster child, generative AI, OpenAI, ChatGPT kind of things. Is that impacting the Philippines? How does the Philippines deal with that? Can it have a leading role, or is it a taker of that? How is it different in a place like the Philippines compared to the US or the UK or something like that?
Yeah, so as you point out, AI has been around sort of in the shadows, although consumers use it without even knowing it. For a long time. So no one was particularly paying attention. And then we had the ChatGPT moment end of last year. And then you probably wouldn't be too surprised to hear that set off major alarm bells in Manila and in the Philippines. Again, why? Because of these BPO companies. It's like, oh my gosh, are these 1.5 million people going to be put out of work?
Right.
Have chatbots.
So chatbots replace call center experts.
So there was a bit of panic, I think, originally, and right away there were senators and members of the House who were rushing to introduce, regulatory bills to somehow, protective type of structures to save the jobs. I think that was a natural but somewhat knee-jerk initial reaction. And now through cooperation and education, I think people actually now feeling a lot more positive about it rather than fearful about it, realizing that actually it looks like generative AI isn't so much a replacement. I think the buzzword floating around these days is co-pilot. It seems like every new product launches, it's our AI co-pilot, right? And so, that conjures up a picture of, an airplane cockpit, right? So you got the left seat, you've got the pilot, and then you've got the co-pilot in the right seat, but the decision-making, the ultimate authority, at the end of the day is still in the hands of the pilot. And early results seem to show that productivity is enhanced most by the least skilled workers. So this is actually a pretty good formulation because it means when the BPO companies bring people in, they invest a lot in their training, but a lot of these folks coming in are fairly low skilled, and they can have more productivity and higher levels of skills faster using a co-pilot AI type of approach. And then I think, sort of the macroeconomics kicks in to the extent that if we can produce through efficiency, a more cost-effective solution for our international customers, that should move us up the demand curve, not down the demand curve.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So,
whereas if you don't allow it and other countries adopt it, then you're going to be out of a job anyway because multinationals are going to go elsewhere for their services.
Exactly. I think some of the thinking is sort of wrong because it somehow assumes a zero-sum game type of approach. And that's not what it's going to be. There's going to be elasticity in the demand, and if the prices come down, and by the way, it's not just only the economics; it's also the quality. You get, we've all had the negative experience. Let's face it. Of talking to someone in a foreign country on a support call and being frustrated with the answers and not understanding. Those sorts of things also improve through generative AI. So better quality, lower cost. I think it actually opens up opportunity. And in fact, our local association, it's called IBPAP, the IT Business Process Association of the Philippines, just did a 6-year roadmap, and they're forecasting doubling of the BPO sector in the next 6 years and adding another 1 million jobs.
Because of AI or just?
Not because of AI, but
just the demand is there.
In fact, this analysis, this roadmap was pre-ChatGPT.
Right.
But I don't think on reflection that they feel like they need to tune it down at all. If anything, it might even be more optimistic.
And is the Philippines a taker of AI? Does it just take large language models and so on generated elsewhere? Or do you see it as actually being part of the development process, having its own AI companies or doing something a bit different? Some of the Gulf countries, for example, are trying to pioneer Arabic AI models and that kind of thing.
Correct, yeah. No, we haven't gotten there yet, so it's more a user of AI, but maybe I could segue a little bit to the notion of responsible AI and the concerns around AI and how you use AI. So I think those are just early realizations and discussions that have happened, and maybe as people think that through more and realize, depending on the application, there may be advantages to having a quote-unquote localized large language model that's trained, on
specifically on the local language and culture and
data. But I think we haven't had enough time yet to digest that.
And it probably requires some sort of government intervention to bring it about. And I can imagine that's difficult to orchestrate.
Yes, exactly.
So one other area that you're deeply involved in is healthcare. I was actually not at all surprised. So back at our conference yesterday, that a question was asked on your panel, which was kind of what's the first place or the most important place to direct AI to, and all of you concluded it was healthcare, and that didn't surprise me at all. Actually, that would be my guess too. Do you think there's particular advantages in the Philippines? The problem generally with applying any kind of tech to healthcare is that it's a hugely risk-averse space with all sorts of bureaucracy. Back here in the UK, our National Health Service is, I think, the 5th largest employer in the world. I mean, the bureaucracy in doing anything new is enormous. Could you see things moving more quickly in the Philippines? Is it a different kind of world where actually you could almost lead the way in using AI in healthcare?
I do think so. And, I think this notion of leapfrogging, of emerging economies sort of leapfrogging, they sort of don't have the baggage or the legacy systems that are still somehow being depreciated on the books that have to be written off, sort of applies here. But I think also when you say AI in healthcare, for some reason people seem to think you mean or jump to the conclusion that you're talking about clinical application of AI, clinical decision support. And
it's like diagnosing a tumor or something like that.
Right, and that's where I think a lot of fear is like, is that going to be accurate enough and all that. And if we just take a look, for example, at the U.S., healthcare spend in the U.S. is like 20% of GDP, something
it's
like
enormous.
$2 trillion, $3 trillion a year. I forget the exact number. I think it's closer to 3 now than to 2. The figures have been for many years, 1/3 of that spend is administrative and 2/3 is clinical. So let's do the quick math. That's $1 trillion just in the U.S. on administrative side. Now, of course, the Philippines could only dream of those kinds of numbers. But if anything, the administrative is even less efficient. We still have a lot of paper-based record keeping and that sort of thing. So I think that's really, and so one of the hats I wear, I'm chairman and CTO of a company. Actually, it's a U.S. company called Navix Health, and you mentioned behavioral health, mental health, addiction treatment space. And so it's a startup company, and we've been working on a tool set to embed AI into electronic medical records, but not so much on the clinical care side, although we are exploring decision support, but more around something as simple as how a healthcare provider or a doctor does their note-taking. So note-taking is often rushed, but it's a huge burden. And oftentimes, in fact, I've spoken to so many doctors, because they don't have enough time during the day, it accumulates, and then they stay up till all hours of the night taking their notes or putting their notes in. So we've been able to use generative AI where you can free-form, almost stream of consciousness style dictate. So I saw, patient John Smith, blah, 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 and I don't have to try to structure my thoughts so much. And then literally in less than 60 seconds, the generative AI can structure that into a really excellent clinical note. So that's just one example of where AI will show up. And I think bringing it to the Philippines has really been behind. They don't have the sorts of electronic record systems, other than in the premier hospitals, but in the the typical mass market, if you will. They haven't really embraced EMRs, probably somewhat because of the cost, and also not a clear understanding of the advantage. But something like this now, that applies in any country, whether it's US, UK, Europe, or Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam. You still have to keep records of the patient visit. And so an application like that, I think, could be quite attractive.
Could be a leapfrog. We're coming to the end of our time together, Colin. It's been fascinating. I think for me, the thing that I've learned particularly is just how useful it is, how important it is to have kind of an innate need for a service, telecoms that we started talking about in a country, that can then effectively drive a whole load of things on the basis of that. And that does feel, quite unique to the Philippines. And with its huge use for social media type, it kind of feels like new stuff could potentially happen there. It could be a place where actually new things bubble up. But picking countries which have got that kind of innate demand is such a big enabler to moving things forwards. And then as long as you've got a reasonably benign, reasonably sensible sort of environment around that, then good things happen. Does that sound like a reasonable summary of what we've been talking about?
Yes, excellent summary. And if I can just put a little pitch in here at the end for the Philippines, there's tremendous innovation. As you can see, there's tremendous forward thinking. What we lack is sufficient capital and investment.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe that's a topic for another time.
Yeah.
But I think maybe there might be some in the audience even who want to take a look at the Philippines, because it's a really interesting place to invest.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I've learned an enormous amount about it just in the 2 days that we've been talking to each other. Thank you ever so much, Colin. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.